Russia is not going to use a nuclear weapon because there is no benefit for them to use a nuclear weapon. All they can keep doing is trying to kill innocent Ukrainians using kinetic weapons like this. Whereas if they use a nuclear weapon, there are zero upsides for them. And so I think that now is the time to be resolved, to show resolve, to stick with Ukraine. Ukrainians are not worried about this, by the way. I mean, there's all kinds of commentary coming out of Ukraine with their typical sort of humor. And I think that, we should not start to waver now just because Russia did this. That's exactly what they want.
And when you say that this new announcement, the allowing of ATACMS to be used within the Kursk area, I mean, I suppose we don't actually know what the real restrictions are because they haven't actually been announced, have they? But do you think, I mean, when you've seen what's happened so far, the targeting of the artillery depot in Bryansk and the targeting of the concentrations of North Korean and Russian troops in Kursk. And you're saying that irrespective of that, it's not allowing Ukraine to defend itself. What do you think the point is and what the gain is here? Is it military? Is it political? What is it?
So, of course, the benefit of long-range precision weapons is that Ukraine can use them to destroy headquarters, logistics, artillery, the things that are necessary to enable the mass, which is the Russians' only advantage, mass tens of thousands of troops. They have to have headquarters, artillery, and the logistics, ammunition for that artillery in order to help this massed infantry move forward. So this is why precision is so important, and the ability to reach a place like this ammunition storage site in Bryansk, or apparently headquarters that was hit yesterday by several storm shadows. These are exactly the kind of targets that Ukraine needs to be able to hit to defend what they have achieved in the Kursk bridgehead. Now, the other things that they would want to hit, of course, and which I think we should be helping them hit, are the sites from which these air raids originate, whether they're missiles or aircraft carrying missiles or drone strikes. Their point of origin needs to be hit. In other words, as General Breedlove says, it's better to kill the archer than try to intercept all the arrows.
And it is being framed by some commentators as, a move by President Biden in the last remaining weeks of his presidency to do something, to be seen to do something. Perhaps also to hand something for when the new Trump presidency takes over that could potentially be used in any kind of negotiations as some kind of leverage. Do you see it that way at all?
I think there's two or three things that are at play here. I have been frustrated all along, as have many others, that the administration did not do more sooner to help Ukraine to be more decisive instead of this very, very gradual approach, sometimes referred to as escalation management. And look where we are. All it has done is actually prolong the conflict. So I think now that President Biden is looking for an opportunity to try and do as much as he can in the last 2 months to clear the decks of everything that's already been approved, get that out, get that delivered, and policies such as allowing Ukraine to be able to defend themselves more effectively. And I do see this as basically a gift from the Biden administration to the incoming Trump administration, because that means when President Trump shows up, capabilities will be at a higher level than they have been. And then it's up to Mr. Trump. He can change it back, he could cancel it, or he can leave it in place, because actually he will have enormous leverage over Vladimir Putin from day one. I mean, he can say, "Hey, look, we're gonna stop. We're gonna block your ability to ship oil to China and India, which is what pays for Russia's war machine. We haven't done that yet." Or he can say, "I'm going to give the Ukrainians all the ATACMS that we have," or he can do a lot of things if he wants to. So I don't think anybody knows what Mr. Trump actually intends to do. I think it's I think he he doesn't have to look up to Putin anymore. I mean, he's coming in at a level feeling very confident from the election, and he can see that the Russians are in big trouble.
And what do you think is at stake in Kursk? Will the battle there and whoever holds it by Christmas be critical for any negotiations that take place in 2025?
Well, for sure, this is something, I think one of the objectives of the Kursk counteroffensive was to create a dilemma for the Kremlin, that to have Ukrainian soldiers occupying a part of Russian territory, especially a part that's named Kursk, is significant because they can't just ignore it. And I think it's going to end up being a place where a lot of Russian troops and North Korean troops end up getting killed. Perhaps they'll eventually eliminate this bridgehead at some point. The deadline has already been missed twice, and Putin established a third deadline, I think January 20th, which is the U.S. inauguration, to have it done by then. I imagine the Ukrainians will hold on to it as long as they can, as long as it's worth it for the purpose of having something in hand when it does come down to negotiating time, if we're headed there.
Just want to ask you about Vladimir Putin's signing off of his new nuclear doctrine, lowering the threshold for a nuclear attack by Moscow, which coincided with the use of the ATACMS in Russia. I think I know what you're going to say about it. You can say it anyway, but I'm really interested to know whether that kind of rhetoric, if you take it as, saber rattling to push back and scare countries from supporting Ukraine more, for example, perhaps Germany, and be more cautious. I mean, how is that going to pan out? First of all, do you accept that? And is it having an effect? And then secondly, when Donald Trump comes in as president, do you think we're still going to hear that same kind of rhetoric?
Well, these are great questions. First of all, the concept of nuclear doctrine is important because it drives training, it drives strategic messaging, it drives weapons and equipment procurement and development. And Putin, even though he is a total autocrat, he also has a domestic audience. And there are a lot of people in Moscow that were clamoring for do more, lower the threshold, show that we're tough. So he actually, I think, part of this is aimed at that domestic audience to show that he still is the tough guy. I'm very interested of what the relationship will be between him and President Trump after January the 20th. Putin has actually been pretty quiet. Unlike many other world leaders, he's stayed off the net. I think he's confused or trying to figure out what a Trump administration will be like, just like we all are, looking at the people that are being nominated for various positions, and trying to look at who's the number two person in all those cabinet posts that will really be the ones driving policy, in my view. So I think he's probably having to deal with the uncertainty of Donald Trump right now.
In terms of the appointments that we know that his choices so far, Donald Trump as president, or president-elect for now, what can you read into how policy will be adapted or pursued or developed for Ukraine?
Well, of course, I have my great hope for the administration actually lies in the Congress. The senior Republican leadership is by and large pro-Ukraine, pro-NATO, pro-transatlantic. And I think that they will be in a place that they could actually moderate or influence U.S. policy towards Ukraine, U.S. policy towards Russia. That's certainly what I am anticipating. I think they'll be able to convey that, look, don't turn your back on Ukraine. This is important for us. It affects our economy. It affects how China views our will. All of these things. So that's what I'm counting on, is the Congress to play a role. Now, obviously, from the campaign, Vice President-elect Vance was a very, very harsh critic of Ukraine. Elon Musk, other people that are advisors or friends of the president also were that. But the Secretary of State nominee, Senator Rubio, is very pro-Ukrainian. I think that Congresswoman Stefanik, who will be the U.S. ambassador to the UN. Reasonable. So I'm less worried there. What's going to be interesting to see is when these nominees do go before the Senate for confirmation hearings, and of course the administration would like to avoid some of that. But this is going to be a test for the Senate to fulfill their constitutional duty, or do they forfeit power?
And you've made the point that the real date is more than 6,600 days since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. That was when you were Commander US Army Europe. Did you ever foresee at that moment the potential for this to become what it looks like it is today, is an era-defining conflict?
Well, of course, I did get called out after I tweeted that number that my math was off by a couple of thousand days, which is true. But yes, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. And I think it's important that we date the beginning of this conflict from 2014, because Ukraine has been fighting against Russian forces since that time. And the large-scale invasion, of course, is when it got to such high intensity, began in February 22. So thank you for reminding that this war has been going on quite a long time. I did not, I couldn't tell or didn't realize it would be going on 10 years later when it started in 2014. I was pretty sure that the Russians were never, ever going to live up to any agreement under the Minsk process. I mean, we saw that. We had American, British, Canadian troops that were in Ukraine helping to train Ukrainians beginning back as early as, I think, 2015. So we were watching this. In fact, we even changed our own training because we saw what the Ukrainians were dealing with against the Russians. So it caused us to change how we approached war fighting and to help kind of shake us out of our counterterrorism mindset. But I think I did not anticipate the ferocity of the air and missile strikes against civilian targets that we have seen.
You're obviously, as I said at the beginning, you're retired from your post now, retired general. What keeps you supporting Ukraine? What motivates you to be a strong advocate?
Well, obviously, their story, what we see of Ukrainians, the resilience of the population, their determination, that's inspiring. But what keeps me focused on it is what I had said earlier about why this is important for us, why this is important for the United States, for the UK, for the rest of Europe. The refugees that will come pouring in and will affect the European economies, the potential for a war spreading to include NATO countries, which means all of us will then be in it, the perception by China. All of these things have long-term ramifications for our security and our prosperity. Ukraine is bearing the brunt of this, and all we have to do is decide we want them to be successful. And I think that's what we ought to be doing.
Ukraine has been asking for the use of these missiles to be unlocked even further. And I'm not sure whether the wording is just inside the Kursk Oblast or against troops that are, or Russian capability that's planning to attack into it. It I think is the precursor for the expansion of that authorization to use Western supplied missiles over a much longer range throughout Russia itself. So hopefully we'll quickly see the restrictions that have been on the Storm Shadow or the French equivalent, the Scalp missiles, eased off so that they can be used by the Ukrainians as well.
Now, that's very interesting. You do think this is the precursor to that happening? You don't think this is as far as it will go?
No, if you look at everything that's developed over we're getting close to 1,000 days of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation. We've always pushed the boundaries a little bit and a little bit more and a little bit more, and there's never been an implication because of it. So, main battle tanks have come in, Western trainings come in, Western aircraft have come in, Western air defense systems have come in, and the Russians have done nothing. The Ukrainians have invaded physical territory inside Russia, and nothing has happened. This is the next step. So it's logical that it'll go further, and it's just when. If I was in a position, I'd take the gloves off today, because I don't think there are any major implications, apart from more Ukrainians are dying whilst we wait to make this final decision.
I mean, predictably, the Kremlin is not impressed by this decision. I think one Russian senator's come out and said this is a precursor to World War III. I take it you would say that is just classic Russian hyperbole, and that actually, as you've just outlined, every time there has been an apparent escalation by the West, if you want to use that language, Russia doesn't respond.
Well, exactly. And Vladimir Putin himself has said that the supply of these missiles and their use inside Russia would be seen as the West directly attacking Russia, and Russia would be at war with the West. We're going to see that disappear completely. There'll be lots more nuclear saber rattling and other saber rattling and everything else, and comments coming out from different places, but it'll fizz away as it always has done. Putin doesn't have the ability to take it any further. He's not going to go down the nuclear line, as we've seen reported in some newspapers where prime ministers were preparing for that, because if he does, he will lose the tacit support he relies on, in particular from China, but also from the likes of India, Pakistan, where he's exporting a lot of his crude oil to be refined into petrol, and then petrol and diesel, and then sold back to us again.
Just looking at what difference these ATACMS will actually make operationally. I mean, in Kursk, we've seen Russia recapture about a third of the territory that Ukraine seized over the summer. Do you think this will potentially put an end to any Russian advances in Kursk? I mean, what kind of difference do you think they'll make?
It'll make a big difference in that what it'll do is it'll push Russia's ability to concentrate its logistics, concentrate its troops, concentrate its equipments close to where it wants to then use them in a tactical battle, and it's going to have to push them back further. ATACMS, the ones that I think they're going to allow Ukraine to fire, has got a range of about 190 miles, 330 kilometers. And that's a long distance from a tactical perspective to push back those elements that you're needing to support the close battle. And that will have a major impact on Russia's ability to concentrate its force, and therefore will allow Ukraine to have much more effect with the tactical weapons that it's got. At the moment, the Russians are quite safely concentrating everything very close to where they need to engage it. When there's a problem, they take another force and push it in quite quickly. Now it's going to take them hours and hours. And whilst it's moving down those routes, it's vulnerable as well. So this is quite significant in the support to the tactical battle. At an operational level, it's sending a very clear message to the Russians that the West is continuing to take its gloves off and allow Ukraine to fight freely.
And then let's say the logical next step is followed, and President Biden, before he leaves office, allows long-range missiles such as Storm Shadow and Scalp to be used on other targets inside Russia by Ukraine. What difference do you think that will make? I mean, people talk about it being a game changer. We've heard that language used before around a whole range of weaponry, including things like the F-16s. I'm always skeptical when people talk about game changers, but how big a difference do you think that would make?
No one capability is going to be a game changer. So the F-16s were never going to be, the main battle tanks were never going to be, the use of Storm Shadow Scalp outside where it's been used at the moment. The Ukrainians are using them very successfully inside Russian-held territory inside Ukraine at the moment. But what it'll do is, again, start to push that Russian capability even further back. It'll allow Ukraine to try to start to attack the airfields that Russia is using to provide close air support into its operations in Ukraine and covering its operations in the Kursk region. It will start to push some of the strategic bomber sites further back, so that Ukraine gets an even longer warning time as to when the strategic bombers are taking off to launch their missiles against Ukraine, as we saw happen only a couple of days ago, where hundreds were launched in. It will stop the drone sites where the Shahed 136 Iranian-supplied drones, now manufactured in Russia, are being launched in huge numbers, because Ukraine will be able to identify where those launch sites are and respond to those very quickly indeed, and deal with the launchers and deal with the sites. So it will cause the Russians a real headache when it comes to prosecuting the operations they're enjoying prosecuting at the moment with virtually no threat.
We'll come on to Trump in just a moment. Just finally on the ATACMS, how do you think Vladimir Putin will be reacting to this in the Kremlin? Because, for months now, he might have thought he's got away with this and that he won't have these long-range missiles sanctioned by the US, and now it's happened. How do you think he will be feeling in response to this?
Well, it's interesting. I saw Putin's body language whenever he was first told about it, and he was shocked. He's been shocked by a number of different things. I think this telephone call that allegedly happened between Trump and Putin, which Putin's team has denied ever happened, resulted in nude pictures of Melania Trump being plastered all over Russian national television. That, from an old spy's perspective, which Putin is sending a threat and a warning back to Trump, saying, if I'm going to do this, then watch out for what will come next. Putin will not be happy that this decision has been made. And it wouldn't surprise me if Trump's team has actually influenced Biden's team under the table to get this decision made now so that Trump doesn't have to do it and it leaves him more negotiating room in different things. These sorts of levels of decision are not going to happen in complete isolation as we're in a transitional period between presidents. The whole thing is fascinating. Putin, I think, is concerned and won't really know where to maneuver. So that's why we'll hear the standard rhetoric starting to come out as he tries to work out what to do. He'll increase his attacks against Ukraine. He'll try and punish them for this, but he's already started that against infrastructure. He'll be hoping that that will have some form of impact. But I think at the moment, he doesn't know where to maneuver, which is good because that means he doesn't have the initiative. The pace is being dictated by the international community and by the Ukrainians. And he's hurting. That's why he's relying on North Korea now for troops, on recruiting in Africa for troops, on North Korea for ammunition, for the Iranians for drone technology, and the Chinese for other technology. It will be costing him economically dear.
Well, let's come on to Donald Trump and what a second Trump administration will mean for Ukraine. President Zelensky said over the weekend he thinks it'll mean now that the war will end sooner because of Trump in the White House. Do you agree with that?
I think it will, but I don't think the conditions are right for it to end yet. And I think there's a lot of rhetoric around comments that Trump made when he was president, first of all, where he was actually just trying to bully the international community and bully NATO and NATO members into making sure that they paid their 2% of GDP, as they agreed to when they became members of NATO, into defence to stop the US having to fund everything. Not every NATO member has done that, so we'll see more threats against NATO and against the international community. Trump is a businessman and he approaches things from a business perspective. So if we look at the investment that's going into the US defense industrial base, it's needed because of the instability that's growing around the world. And the Democrats had started to reduce the amount of spending. Trump came in on a flag of building up US military capability. And a big part of that is this defense industrial base. So you can make enough ammunition, you can make enough missiles, you can make enough pieces of equipment. A lot of the money that's being spent on Ukraine, that $60 billion, has not been given to Vladimir Zelensky as a check where he puts it in his bank account and spends it as he wants to. It's actually being spent in the United States, in US defense industrial base, creating jobs, creating manufacturing capacity, creating support industries, and generating taxpayers, additional taxpayers. That's giving tax revenue back into the US economy. So it's a good thing. Trump's not going to take that away. He's not going to create mass unemployment in his defense industrial base. He'll make lots of sounds about stopping war, but war, unfortunately, is economically good for the United States and elsewhere. So I think we'll see him continuing that, but he will be concerned about 3 conflicts around the world and the US being expected to try and deal with all 3 of them. And he'll want other countries, especially ones which have got huge economic power, to build their defence industrial bases up and to start to take some responsibility. And that's why I think we're seeing the next deployment of the UK carrier battle group going down to Southeast Asia to try and relieve some of the tension from US carrier battle groups around Pacific and around what's going on in Taiwan. The French carrier battle group is planning to do exactly the same. So we're trying to see a level of burden sharing and that going out for political statements. That's what Trump will like. But he Doesn't particularly like the EU because he sees it as a trading bloc rival. He will see the build-up of the defence industrial base in Europe as something that's necessary, but he'll also see it as competition to the United States and what's coming out of there. So that'll be an interesting balance to see. He won't feel comfortable with the government in the UK acting as the bridge because, in simplistic American terms, and unfortunately, our cousins will try and take the complexities of British politics and simplify them into American speak. In American speak, Labour Party equals the Democrats, Starmer equals Biden, Harris. The Conservative Party equals the Republicans, Boris Johnson equals Trump. And that's the way that he will think and his team will think as they try to look at the difference of policy. So it's going to take very, very hard work, I think, from Keir Starmer and David Lammy to maintain a strong political and economic relationship with America, given that. And it will mean that they will probably have to suggest that they are more right of centre than they're coming out with. It will be interesting times, I think.
It's really interesting getting your assessment, Philip, on what a Trump presidency will mean for Ukraine, because, I've picked up from a lot of analysts in the past fortnight since the US election, maybe more optimism or maybe less pessimism is maybe the way of putting it about what a Trump presidency means for Ukraine than maybe there was before. And maybe people had took too literally past comments about I'll end the war in 24 hours or whatever. Is that a fair assessment of how you view things, that Trump has a more complicated relationship with Ukraine than sometimes we give him credit for?
Yeah, Trump's got a more complicated relationship with Ukraine and with Russia and with lots of other things. And he doesn't think like a politician. And that's what really worries people. I do think, if you compare the two, you compare Harris to him, Harris would have probably continued with the Biden type approach. And therefore, there would have been uncertainty in supply of weapons. There would have been periods of time when there would have been hiatus, especially if there wasn't majorities across the House, which the different houses, which there isn't. And that would have probably created greater pain for Ukraine. At least with Trump, there will be a degree of certainty once he starts to get his policies out there. And that is what Ukraine needs, and that's what the international community needs. The biggest threat to the international world order with Trump is his unpredictability. People or politicians like to be able to predict how someone is going to react to different things, and that they'll formulate their policies and create their papers and hold their meetings and have their positions to take all around that. With Trump, they can't do it. And that means that our politicians are going to have to think on their feet. And not necessarily react to whatever he says, but try and put that into context. That is politically challenging. I think Zelensky, if anyone, he can see a path to playing Trump to make sure that he gets support, because it's almost certain that Trump will get Putin and get Zelensky and metaphorically crash their heads together and say, you two come up with a peace plan. Zelensky, if he's smart, will turn around and say, yep, I'm happy to negotiate. Let's get some plans on the table, and I will give some ground. Putin will come in and say, here's my peace plan. I'm keeping everything that I've got. And by the way, I want another chunk, and will give no ground. And if he gives no ground and Zelensky's saying, hey, but I'm willing to negotiate, then Trump is put in a position where he's going to have to continue to support Zelensky and support him more aggressively. And I think Zelensky's got the wider diplomatic skills and the people skills to understand that and to play it to his good effect.
Just as we round off this conversation, Philip, obviously we've spoken a lot about the geopolitics of the situation. Just to focus on what's happening on the ground in Ukraine currently, how would you assess the situation on the front line, particularly in the east?
In the east, the Russians have got the initiative. The Russians are advancing slowly, very slowly. It's costing them a lot. It's costing them between 1,700 and 2,000 troops a day being killed or severely wounded. They're still losing huge numbers of pieces of equipment. They're making small advances in retaking Kursk, the Kursk region again, but again at huge, huge cost. They're running out of capability and running out of troops. But Russia still retains the tactical initiative. Ukraine had it last year whenever they carried that incursion out into Kursk. That sort of dislocated what the Russians were planning to do, but they've just kept up this meat grinder. We're now hitting a point where that will probably continue, but then as winter gets in, Russia will advance even more and more and more slowly because it just saps the energy out of its troops. However, this conflict is not going to be won at a or lost at a tactical level. It's going to be won or lost at what happens at an operational level or a strategic level. And this is where Ukraine retains the initiative in dealing with things. It is dictating the pace of what's happening in different places like that. And again, if we compare this to similar conflicts in history or other conflicts in history, during Vietnam, the US didn't lose a single tactical battle, but they lost the war. They lost the conflict. During Afghanistan, I don't think Allied troops in Afghanistan against the Taliban lost a single tactical battle. But who now controls Afghanistan? And therefore, we can't measure things purely on what is happening on the front line. We have to look at this much more in a 3D or 4D or 5D perspective because it is a very, very complex war.
And would you very much say this is in no way an escalation? I mean, you have the Kremlin spokespeople already coming out saying this is an unprecedented escalation. I think Dmitry Peskov said it was adding fuel to the fire and that it's qualitatively a change in the US position. A Russian foreign ministry spokesperson said it's a radical change in the essence and nature of the war. And yet, actually, this is entirely within the confines of international law. And when you consider what Russia has been doing in terms of deploying North Korean troops in Kursk, which seems like a serious escalation, I mean, I would argue this is not an escalation. But what is your reading on that, Rupert?
No, I will completely agree with you. It's not remotely an escalation. But of course, because the West has imposed these sort of restrictions, it's a kind of PR win for Moscow. It just plays completely into their hands to allow then Moscow to come out with, and Putin hasn't commented on this recently, but to come out with these absolutely ridiculous claims about escalation. They're not remotely escalation. They're absolutely all about giving Ukraine the ability to defend themselves. So not an escalation at all. Merely taking off a shackle that should never have been there. And you're absolutely right to say the only significant escalation that's happened recently is the provision of North Korean troops in support of Russia. I mean, that really is very escalatory. Ukraine are just continuing to defend themselves.
Does the strength of the response, nonetheless, though, from the Kremlin, does that suggest they're rattled in some way by this? Because presumably they would have thought, given it hadn't happened until now, that maybe these long-range missiles would not be approved by the US.
Yeah, I mean, I think they had grounds to think that they were going to play for time. Biden's administration not long to go, and they might have thought they were just going to be able to sit this out. Whether they're rattled is hard to tell, but they certainly will be thinking carefully about the implications of this because, of course, they've been able to exploit this constraint by positioning assets much closer to the front line than they'd have been able to do. Knowing they could sit there with impunity, they can no longer do those things. So those supply dumps, the infrastructure, the routes, the headquarters, all those things behind the front line, assembly areas that were sort of almost kind of out of bounds. It's like some slightly peculiar board game where the rules said that these couldn't be touched. And of course, Russia has been able to exploit that. They can no longer do so. Those assets will now be in harm's way. And I'd expect the Ukrainians to go after them very aggressively.
Well, let's just expand on that if you can, Rupert. I mean, what difference do you think it's going to make on the ground in Kursk? And to begin with, we understand these ATACMS are only going to be allowed to be used in the Kursk Oblast. We understand Russia have regained about a third of the territory that Ukraine captured over the summer in recent months. What difference do you think this is actually going to make on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to make a difference. Undoubtedly, these are extremely capable missiles that can now be used to their full potential. Out to almost 200 miles. Very, very capable. And that is, of course, a good thing. But what we mustn't do, and you and I have discussed this before, as have many others, is to think that the provision of a single new capability to Ukraine's arsenal is decisive. You know, we've had these conversations, haven't we, when main battle tanks were put into the fight, when F-16s came into the game. And quite understandably, it always generates a bit of conversation. Is this going to be the game changer? None of these things are game changer in and of themselves. As you know, warfare is about the orchestration of all of these assets, and now they've got another instrument to play with to bring bear. That is helpful, but in and of itself, it can't change the calculus of the battle. And as you say, in the first instance, it appears that they will be used in around Kursk to allow the Ukrainians to defend their foothold there.
Is this, in your view, Rupert, one last gesture by the Biden administration in support of Ukraine? Or could we still see, between now and Donald Trump's inauguration at the end of January, could we see, for example, the Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles also being approved for use and potentially outside of Kursk?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to know, isn't it, what the politics in Washington are that have brought about this decision now. I confess, always found it pretty extraordinary, the political decision-making in the first place that led to the missiles not being provided. So who knows, what the administration is thinking about as to, is it trying to secure its legacy? What is it that it's trying to do? Hard to know. It would seem to me that the Washington hasn't got much more to offer this side of Trump's inauguration.
I mean, I suppose, just to play devil's advocate, the arguments in favor of this more piecemeal approach to, weapon supplies to Ukraine, and you mentioned, there was the debate about main battle tanks, then it was the F-16s, now we've got these long-range missiles. I suppose if you gave Ukraine access to all of them in one go at the start, even though that would clearly help them on the battlefield, that maybe would be a significant escalatory action that could provoke a drastic response from Moscow. And the argument might be that the piecemeal approach is wiser in the long term.
Yeah, and of course that is an argument. It's an argument I would wholly push back on, because of the point I made earlier, that these are restrictions that should not have been there in the first place, because Ukraine has absolute right under the law of armed conflict to use the weapons at its disposal for self-defense. And self-defense includes striking legitimate targets, in this case, inside of Russia. The law is absolutely clear about that. And by being so rather mealy-mouthed, as frankly we have been for the last 2 years in the provision of our equipment, we just play into Moscow's hands, not only on the battlefield, but going back to our earlier conversation, because it just gives Moscow another ability to come out with this false narrative. If you just do it all at once, Putin gets to say his ridiculous lies, and then we move on to the next thing. And oh, by the way, all the way through, it has been clear that Putin's threats of escalating to tactical nuclear weapons and all of these sort of things, they'd never led to any substance. And the idea that President Putin has in his arsenal the ability to really change the calculus of the war seems fallacious. Now, that's not to say they can't make tactical gains on the battlefield. They can, and they are, but they're very small gains. These aren't substantial breakthroughs. So I think we should continue to assess Putin's threats carefully, of course, and I'm absolutely certain the intelligence communities are doing that really, really rigorously. But then assess and judge his words against his previous actions.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget, you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below. Let's come on to the election of Donald Trump. Of course, he'll be inaugurated for his second term as US president in January. Some of the analysts I've spoken to since his election victory a fortnight ago on Frontline have actually said that maybe we have been too pessimistic about what a Trump presidency means for Ukraine. And certainly some of the mood music from his conversations, his early conversations since his victory with President Zelensky, has seemed more positive. Now, of course, Zelensky's a very good diplomat, and he knows it's in his interest to try and build good relations with Trump. But how do you see the relationship between Kyiv and Washington playing out under a Trump presidency?
I mean, I think the first thing to say is we don't know. We should watch this space carefully. I think it's fair to say. But I would agree with those comments. I think President Trump, he likes to use really bold phrases. I'll end the war in a day. He's used previous comments in his last presidency, but he doesn't want to be a loser. He really cares about what people think about him. He's got this kind of slight blind spot that in many ways most politicians do not. And I suspect you were thinking carefully about President Biden's legacy with regards to Afghanistan and the ignominious withdrawal of American and indeed NATO forces at President Biden's bidding. You throw away your gains if you do that. If President Trump takes a similar approach in Ukraine, he will have that on his conscience. He'll have it on his legacy. And I don't think he'll want to do that. He's a deal maker. He's a pragmatist. He'll be looking for some way through this. But I think it's most unlikely that that's going to involve just throwing in the towel, handing the gold to Putin. And I'm sure that Trump will wish to negotiate in some way or form with Putin in a way that others have not. But I don't think that automatically leads to capitulation for Ukraine. I think it's been much more nuanced than that. I certainly hope it will be.
And I think what's pretty clear is he wants some kind of peace deal at some point. He wants some kind of negotiated settlement. But actually, I would say that the mood music from Ukraine is more positive towards that. If there was some kind of freezing of the front lines, Kyiv might be more open to that. At the moment, the Kremlin are very, very much insistent that they want the complete capitulation of Ukraine, which simply isn't going to happen. And so if Trump feels like Moscow is being obstructive in some way, he may look more sympathetically on Ukraine. And I think he's made the comments in the past that he's prepared to arm Ukraine to the teeth if Moscow don't come around the negotiating table.
I think that's absolutely right. People who think they can genuinely negotiate with President Putin haven't studied him enough, nor have they studied actually the history of Russia and how Russia does its business. So the idea of a real negotiation in good faith with President Putin seems unlikely. As you say, that the facts on the ground are probably changing views a little bit in Kyiv about, outright victory, regaining all of their pre-2014 lands. And so some kind of frozen conflict seems possible, undesirable, but every outcome, frankly, or every credible outcome is, frankly, undesirable. I don't buy the talk of some kind of, UN policed demilitarized zone. I simply don't know how that would come about. The idea that any NATO forces could be part of that UN. I don't see how that's a thing. But a frozen conflict, and of course there was a frozen conflict in Ukraine prior to the latest invasion 1,000 days ago. And so returning to some kind of frozen conflict, deeply unpalatable though it is for the Ukrainians, may seem more appealing than it did a year, 2 years ago. And this is where their incursion into Kursk, it seems to me, has always been a smart move. Because, there was lots of talk at the time, which I'm afraid I just didn't buy at all, that Kursk was all about taking pressure off of the front line and drawing Russian reserves. For me, that was completely missing the big play. The big play was a strategic one, which was to take some sovereign Russian soil, which is humiliating for President Putin, and finally gives President Zelensky a genuine bargaining chip. It almost doesn't matter how big that salient is. As long as they can hold some sovereign Russian territory, then they have a very, very potent bargaining chip. Because, as I say, you can't negotiate with President Putin in good faith. But if you've got something he needs back, and make no mistake, he needs his Russian soil back, that is deeply humiliating to him, then it gives you in a position of greater strength when the music stops.
Is there a difference in what ATACMS and Storm Shadows can do? And do we know the numbers that Ukraine has actually?
So we don't know the numbers. And I suspect they're being closely guarded for an excellent reason, which is that you don't want the Russians to know that you might have run out. There have been various estimates of maybe there were several hundred of each given. And as I say, the rate of which they've been used suggests that we're a long way into that. But I think we won't know numbers until maybe after the war has ended. They are used against different targets. And again, this depends on the warhead. So Storm Shadow is reasonably straightforward. It's a bunker busting weapon. It basically has a dual warhead to help you get through, thick concrete defenses or other barriers. So the first warhead detonates, it punches a hole through which, this is all happening in milliseconds, the second warhead passes through the gap, gets inside the target, and then it detonates. So you'd use that against something that's buried or thick walls, very effective. You wouldn't use it against anything that's sort of exposed or out in the open. It's a relatively small warhead for that purpose. That's where ATACMS comes in. It's a ballistic missile, first of all, so difficult to intercept. Storm Shadow is a cruise missile, although it can fly very low, is kind of hard to spot, but it's not moving very, very quickly. ATACMS is coming in, very difficult angle, very high speed. What we don't know is what type of warheads they've got. There is a large unitary warhead, big, explosive. There is also a cluster variant that scatters hundreds of submunitions over an area. And you could use the unitary warhead against a building or something that's caught in the open. But that's where the cluster variant would come in, because you can cover hundreds of square meters, say an airfield, and take out aircraft, helicopters, troops that have been caught in the open, anything that's in, is in an area that's difficult to get at, but you can scatter it with submunitions and deny it. So there are different targets for the two weapons. You might use ATACMS also against, if you could identify an air defense site, radars, ground-based missile launchers, those kind of things.
What's going to be really interesting is the kind of resources and the energy that Ukrainian forces put into holding what they still have of Kursk, because it has been described as an important bargaining chip for Ukraine, and it has lost, as you said earlier, around half the ground it had since August. What does President Zelensky have to weigh up when he's considering the price worth paying for it, for any political gains, if there are negotiations ahead that involve land?
The first thing he's got to factor in is actually the Russian desire for negotiation. I'm aware that, I include myself in this, we often talk as if President Trump is going to come in, he will force negotiations and they will take place. The truth is, first of all, Zelensky has a domestic political constituency to deal with, many of whom are getting tired and would accept some kind of discussion, but they wouldn't accept large territorial compromises. But there's also the question of, why would the Russians talk now? If they feel like they've got the upper hand and they think they have another, let's speculate, 6 months during which they can sustain the current level of extreme casualties, why would they go to talks immediately if they think they can move the front line another 20 kilometers? Maybe join up the 4 oblasts that they're interested in and then talk? Why would they allow the Kursk lodgement to stay the way that it currently is? By chipping away at it, they reduce its value. So I think the challenge for Zelensky is that he might be past the optimum point for negotiations, with the tide slightly turning. He's got to make a calculation of, can he convince Trump to give it another go in terms of support for Ukraine? Can he make an argument that Trump should back Ukraine because they can be winners? Or are all of his choices bad compromises, in which case the sooner the better to try and freeze things? And the big problem for the Ukrainians is, what's the end state? Is this an assumption that there will be a freeze? Do they think the Russians will just come back and try again in the future? Are they prepared to accept a territorial compromise in terms of future security guarantees? I mean, there are so many variables here, and I think it's not actually guaranteed that we will move straight into negotiations in January.
And it's interesting that coinciding, when you mentioned sort of the perhaps everyone's assumed that President Putin might want to enter into negotiations. Actually, it might be the absolute opposite at the moment. And that response that he made this week in officially changing or signing off the changes to his nuclear doctrine to lower that threshold to warrant a nuclear strike. the response to that has been very wide-ranging, hasn't it? I mean, I just wonder where you see that. Is it a sign of confidence and just keeping the word nuclear in the headlines to try and have as much political impact as it can at the moment? And actually, in terms of like the detail of what it really means, it doesn't really change an awful lot. How do you see it?
Well, I'm not. I should caution this. I'm not a deep nuclear doctrine expert. Talking to some of the people who are, it feels like there's a hefty dose of skepticism over the extent of those changes. So some of them are unsurprising, extending deterrence, for example, to Belarus, given that there's been exercises and deployment of nuclear-capable weapons there. Some of it's not particularly credible, as in there is doubt whether threats to Crimea would really result in direct nuclear use. Some of it is putting onto paper statements that Putin has said previously about the circumstances that would trigger a Russian nuclear response, and some of it's bluster. I think it's right that people remain concerned about both escalation and nuclear escalation in particular, so we shouldn't be glib about it. But overall, yes, it's mostly signalling. It's mostly waving the nuclear stick as a reminder that this is the status that Russia has, that people need to be wary. It is fundamentally aimed not just at the Ukrainians to intimidate, but also international backers to warn them of what will happen. I think the truth is that applies in reverse as well. And the Russians are largely operating conventionally. You know, they keep adding conventional mass, different conventional weapons. I think it's not too much of a stretch to say they've priced in things like Storm Shadow and ATACMS use on Russian territory without resorting to actually climbing the nuclear ladder, because they are concerned about a confrontation with NATO that they know would be hugely damaging for them, both conventionally and in nuclear terms. So a lot of this is attempting to reaffirm, with varying degrees of credibility, their previous statements and status.
And Britain came out very strongly in response to this, dismissing it as ridiculous. But does it have perhaps a stronger effect on other NATO allies, maybe Germany, for example?
Yes, and it's difficult to really get into the head of, say, the German government, and of course that's about to change, and how it affects people. I think there is clearly an element of retained nervousness around the risks of a confrontation with Russia, although in many cases that results in restraint that feels overblown. So there is a medium-term problem with the Russian military in that they can probably over time rebuild their army. And that is the thing that has taken these horrendous casualties. They have, largely speaking, retained their air force and navy, particularly outside the Black Sea Fleet. Conventionally, there is significant overmatch in NATO's favour in Europe. It's worth remembering that. If you include the US. I think the problem is that Europe has been quite happy to sit underneath the US nuclear and conventional umbrella and is late to beginning its own rearmament. It has started. Germany's spending money. Lots of other people are producing highly capable forces, but numbers are small. It's not really for me to sort of tell the German government to sort of get over it. But I thought it was striking that even in the aftermath of the ATACMS debate and Storm Shadow debate, or at least in the run-up to it, that Chancellor Scholz was still absolutely adamant that no Taurus, for example, their cruise missile, was not going to Ukraine. And they are still talking in a way that suggests that they are, to a degree, intimidated by Russia.
We've heard all kinds of bloodthirsty threats from President Putin in response to President Biden agreeing to the use of long-range US missiles within Russia. He's threatening the use of nuclear weapons. He's threatening asymmetric attacks, hybrid attacks within NATO countries such as the UK or the US, all kinds of threats. And one of the easiest things that President Putin can do is to launch new attacks on Kiev and other Ukrainian cities. I should emphasize here, James, Putin's argument is always that it's somebody else's fault. He himself keeps escalating this war. First of all, he starts the war at a point where there was no possible military threat from Ukraine. Then he uses Iranian drones, Shahid drones, to attack every corner of Ukraine. He uses Russian ballistic missiles, Iskander missiles, Kinjal missiles. Then he uses North Korean ballistic missiles to attack Ukraine. Then he uses North Korean troops. So each of these steps is a massive escalation. Then as soon as anybody else escalates, he sets red lines saying, if this happens, then there will be awful consequences for you. So it's very risky what President Putin is saying. We're all very concerned about any possible use of nuclear weapons, but it is worth bearing in mind that he's been making these threats for nearly 3 years since the original Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
And on the point about the US embassy, I mean, I hear absolutely what you say, Leigh, about Putin's track record of escalating this conflict. But even he surely would not be stupid enough to carry out any kind of direct attack on the US embassy.
It's highly unlikely that Russia would deliberately attack an embassy. There are tragic precedents for this. For example, during the NATO bombing campaign in Serbia back in the 1990s, I believe it was a US missile or a US bomb struck the Chinese embassy in the Serbian capital, Belgrade. That was seen as being a mistake, almost certainly was a mistake. And I would be very surprised if the Russian forces would deliberately attack a US embassy. That would be an enormously provocative and aggressive step. However, when people start lobbing ballistic missiles and other missiles and bombs into a crowded urban area, mistakes can always happen. And there's no doubt that for anybody who's in Ukraine, this is an extremely dangerous situation. And if the US intelligence services have picked up intimations that Russia is planning further major attacks on Kiev, it's not surprising that they are taking precautionary measures.
How do you think the West should approach Russia's various threats of escalation? I mean, for instance, the fact that these ATACMS and these anti-personnel mines haven't been approved until now would suggest that the Biden administration has been wary of this threat of escalation. The fact that they still have not, and I don't fully understand why they haven't, but the fact they still have not approved the use of long-range Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles, you would have thought speaks to a fear of escalation. How justified would you say that fear is, and how should the West approach it?
It's a tricky balance, James. On the one hand, this change of Russian nuclear doctrine, which they've announced, they're now saying that an attack from a non-nuclear state, if backed by a nuclear power, will be treated as a joint attack on Russia. And it's designed to give the impression that the use of Russian nuclear weapons in response to Ukrainian attacks inside Russia has become more likely. And this is very concerning. We've seen, for example, President Macron and US spokespeople warning Russia not to make these really irresponsible threats of using nuclear weapons. You have to take them seriously because any use of nuclear weapons would be unprecedented since 1945. So we do have to look at this with extreme concern. I was talking earlier on about President Trump using a madman strategy, and President Putin, of course, also loves to use this madman strategy. You can see the gleam in his eyes. You never know what we might do. At the same time, these nuclear threats from Russia, or the threat of using nuclear weapons by Russia, are problematic on a number of grounds. One is that it cannot be right, it cannot be permitted that if a nuclear-armed country invades another country, in this case Russia attacking Ukraine, you can't fight back. It must be possible to fight back against a nuclear-armed country. You can't just say, well, because they threaten to use nuclear weapons, the country that's being attacked can't defend itself. The second argument is that if Russia uses nuclear weapons, it's a colossal escalation. The first time nuclear weapons have been used since 1945, and it would lower the threshold for Russia's neighbors, or for any country threatened by Russia, to acquire nuclear weapons themselves, potentially to use them against Russia. We've even heard Ukraine saying, if we can't join NATO, we might have to develop our own nuclear weapons. So it's a very problematic threat for Russia itself, as well as driving a coach and horses through global efforts to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. It would be also, in the context of Russia's own nuclear strategy, using nuclear weapons is very much opening the Pandora's box. It's all or nothing. Nobody knows what would happen if a country used nuclear weapons, what that would lead to. And Russia's own nuclear doctrine suggests that once you've launched nuclear weapons, that's it. You're really opening the door to Armageddon. Now, there is, of course, one very easy way to extinguish completely any threat to Russia from these long-range missiles, from any other weapons that Ukraine has, which is to stop the war and withdraw Russian troops from Ukrainian territory that they are occupying illegally, in many cases since 2014, and the war would end tomorrow, and there would be no more threat to Russia. And that door is open to Russia, and I would strongly advise them to open it and go through that door.
Let's come on to what the return of Donald Trump to the White House means for Ukraine. Certainly in the build-up to the US election, among Ukraine supporters, there was a certain pessimism about what a Trump presidency would mean for Ukraine. I suspect in recent weeks, I've sort of picked up on, I don't know whether it's a bit of bargaining based on the reality of the situation or whether it is actually grounded in reality, but a little more optimism about potentially what a Trump administration might mean, and it wouldn't necessarily mean selling Ukraine out. What is your sense, Leigh, of what a Trump presidency may mean for Ukraine in the war?
Undoubtedly, a Trump victory, which we have now seen in the US elections, is not what Ukraine was hoping for. And I'm sure that Vladimir Putin and people in the Kremlin were delighted with that Trump victory, simply because Trump and his supporters have consistently talked about cutting military and economic aid to Ukraine. We saw this between October 2023 and April 2024, that the US stopped providing military support to Ukraine, and that crippled Ukraine's war effort and saw rapid Russian advances. So that threat is extremely concerning to Ukraine. For the reasons that I've already set out, there are glimmers of hope. We can point to Trump being very unpredictable. We can point to Trump not wanting to hand victory to Russia on a plate. But it is quite concerning. And if Trump were to cut military supplies to Ukraine, the question then would be, is the UK and our other friends of Ukraine, such as in the European Union, ready to ramp up their military supplies to meet US shortfalls? And this would be a huge challenge. It would really mean transforming our support. Now, my view on this has always been that should Trump cut supplies to Ukraine, it would still be a really good investment for UK taxpayers and for the UK in general to up our support to Ukraine, because the alternative, letting Russia win this war, would be immensely more dangerous for us. It would create a much more dangerous world where a nuclear-armed, bigger Russia, incorporating elements of Ukraine into Russian territory, would be a more dangerous adversary, more likely to attack again. And other countries all around the world that have thought, I'd like to invade my neighbor, but I'll never get away with it, will think, actually, I might get away with it. I'm going to invade my neighbor. And the UK would be in a much more dangerous international environment where our defense spending would be orders of magnitude greater than it is now, whereas supporting Ukraine would be relatively cheap compared with that. So I think we have to hope for the best with Trump, but prepare for the worst. And the worst means preparing to up our consistent long-term aid to Ukraine to stop Russia from winning this war.
What have you made of some of the mood music that's come out of the Trump campaign, or now soon to be the Trump administration, in recent weeks? I mean, for example, there was this idea of a demilitarized zone, a DMZ, between Russia and Ukraine, almost akin to what we have between North and South Korea. Do you think that is in any way feasible?
I'm very concerned about any settlement that freezes the front line where it is now, because that, in effect, means giving Russia victory. Supposing you had a demilitarized zone between what is currently, those parts of Ukraine currently occupied by Russia, and the rest of Ukraine, which Russia has not yet managed to invade. Russia would steam ahead with integrating those elements that it has occupied into Russia. You may recall that they've already passed legislation integrating huge swathes of Ukraine into Russia, an area about the size of England. Something like 18% of Ukraine is currently occupied by Russia. So that would be a disaster for Ukraine to freeze the front line where it is now. I've seen suggestions that you could sweeten this pill or take the edge off such a disastrous outcome by saying, first of all, that that land remains part of Ukraine legally, but Ukraine continues to occupy it for the time being. This would be what's known as the East German model, where Western countries never accepted that East Germany was a separate country or that it was going to be part of Russia. I mean, they did eventually, some of them set up embassies in East Berlin, but it was still seen as being part of Germany. And you could do that with Ukraine, where areas occupied by Russia, such as Crimea or Eastern Ukraine, were recognized as still being part of Ukraine in a longer term settlement. That's one option. But this would be a very tricky path to go down. And for me, I'm afraid, allowing Russia to keep territory which it has seized by force against international law would not only mean Russia winning this war, and Putin winning this war, but would also, as I said earlier, make the world a more dangerous place by encouraging other countries suddenly to see, actually, we can invade and occupy our neighbours without long-term consequences.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.